Welcome back to Untangling Climate Finance. I'm your host, Jay Tipton. And today's episode takes us into a space we have yet to explore on the show: how nature intelligence is reshaping business strategy, sustainability, and finance. I'm joined by Sebastian Leape, the CEO of Natcap, and I am genuinely stoked about this convo because we've yet to have a guest dive this deep into the intersection of nature, data, and financial risk. Sebastian and his team at Natcap are helping companies measure and manage their impacts on nature. Things like deforestation, water use, pollution, and biodiversity loss, while also uncovering their dependencies on ecosystems that keep supply chains and business models running. What makes this especially timely is the surge of regulatory frameworks like the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and that's just to name a few. Now, these aren't just compliance checkboxes. They're powerful tools forcing companies to quantify how they interact with nature and helping move finance towards the places it's needed most. Sebastian explains why businesses that act now, integrating nature data into their decision-making, will be better positioned to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Now, I think this episode will give you all a solid perspective on how nature risk is financial risk and why the next decade of climate finance will depend on understanding that connection. All right, let's do it and hear from Sebastian. Hey, Sebastian, welcome to Untangling Climate Finance. How are you doing today?
Hey there, I'm good, thanks. Looking forward to talking to you.
Where in the world are you calling in from?
So I'm calling in from a refurbished car park in central London, which is about as unnaturey as you can get, but it's our office and it's where a lot of these nature-related decisions are being made, so that's why we're here.
Well, refurbished is a step in the right direction, so that's not bad.
Exactly.
Cool, dude. Well, I appreciate you joining. I always like to start the episodes by getting to know the guest. So why don't you explain a little bit about Sebastian? I know that you spent some of your career working at McKinsey, and now, of course, you're leading Natcap. So how about giving us a little bit of your journey into the world of nature, biodiversity, and risk?
Sure. So I was told that careers always make sense looking backward and not necessarily in the moment. I think mine doesn't make that much sense in the moment or looking backwards, but I can try and tell the story. I've jumped between a whole bunch of different things. I started my career at USAID out in Burundi, Rwanda, working in international development. I then did a chunk of time at McKinsey. I finished as a junior partner there, working on all kinds of different projects with different industries and different geographies, mainly in Washington, DC, but spent some time in Nairobi and London offices, all focused on sustainability. In between, there was a speechwriter for Gordian, which, again, just stimulating and awesome and inspiring and wonderful, but a bit different. I think the thing that brought me from McKinsey world to Natcap was really seeing all of my clients who were big corporates thinking about climate, thinking about their net zero targets, thinking about sustainability, and realizing that the climate lens was only part of the story and that they needed to be thinking about the resources they were using, the deforestation they were guilty of, the pollution that they were generating, moving beyond just a climate lens, and there wasn't really the data or the expertise in the market to help them on that journey. So Natcap really fills that gap, which is helping big companies measure and manage all of the nature-related impacts where they're dependent on nature and then how that translates into risk for the business. So I really saw that opportunity through my time at Natcap. But the reason why nature has such a pull for me is I think it's the same for everyone, is that we all have this spiritual, deep connection with nature. You know, when I'm on a crowded tube train and my nose is stuffed in someone else's elbow, I close my eyes and I think of a lake in Vermont. I think of the Alps. I think of the Scottish Highlands. I think of the most beautiful natural environments and ecosystems I've ever been in, and it's deeply calming. And when I'm in those ecosystems, I have a quasi-spiritual experience. It makes life make sense. And I think that's true for many people. So I've always had that intuitive sense that nature is an important, crucial part of what it means to be a human and want to protect it for that reason. And actually, we're starting to get evidence which is, using the scientific method to make that connection as well. So Professor Kathy Willis, who's one of the academic founders of Natcap, wrote a book called Good Nature, last year, which starts to pull together all of the evidence linking nature and its smells, its tastes, its colors, its sounds with tangible health benefits for humans. So that's just another lens and another string to nature's bow as to why it's so important to protect it and why the work that Natcap does is inspiring to me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When I reflect on my own life and I think back on like core memories that I have, they are literally always when I'm out in nature, whether that's like a hike in Alaska or a hike in like the Dolomites. They're very like light bulb memories that, of course, like supersede any time I was sitting in my office somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
I absolutely agree with you. And then I like the last part you said, because I always appreciate reading scientific reports that will literally say medical patients that are in a hospital, the ones that have a view of like a tree or some greenery outside of their window, literally will recover faster than patients that don't have that type of view, that are just like four walls. So it's just so powerful. It's like one on a very like subconscious who we are as a Homo sapien level, but then also like on a spiritual level. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I think we've got a lot yet to discover as to why that happens, but it definitely does happen.
It certainly does. Great. Well, believe it or not, many of the guests that I've had in the past also don't have very linear career pathways, but there is always a common thread or a common denominator, and it's usually something to do with their values or their morals. And so it sounds like despite all of your little changes of direction in career, you've managed to stick with some of the things that you're very in tune with, which in this case is nature. So you touched a little bit on Natcap, but of course we have some listeners that don't understand what it is that you all do. So why don't you give us the overview of what Natcap does and how it helps companies embed nature into their decision making?
Yeah, definitely. So Natcap helps big companies measure, report, ultimately take action on their interactions with nature. And what that means in practice is it's things like the impacts you're having on land use change and deforestation, the impact you're having on pollution, soil, air, water pollution, noise pollution. It's the impacts you're having on from resource consumption. And then it's where your business is dependent on nature for its ongoing survival and financial stability. So where you're dependent on natural resources like water for semiconductor production, where you're dependent on things like soil health for the production of crops, and taking that impact and dependency data and then translating it into business risks. So what are the risks that your business is exposed to as a result of the impacts you're having and as a result of where you're dependent on nature? And how does that translate into value at stake and ultimately the mitigating actions you need to take to reduce those risks? So that's what Natcap does. And the way I think of it is we are the very natural next chapter in the corporate sustainability journey after climate. We spent the last 15, 20 years as a corporate world, very focused on climate. Companies have set net zero goals, broadly stuck to them, though we've got a bit of backtracking now. They've then set climate strategies. They've then started measuring scope 1, then scope 2, now scope 3 emissions. They've been reporting that to investors and regulators. They've been on journeys to try and reduce those emissions in whatever way makes business sense. So we've been on that journey 15, 20 years, and climate is a lens, but it's only one lens through which to think about sustainability, and it misses a hell of a lot. One framework that I really like is the planetary boundaries, which is basically a summary of the 9 processes that together maintain a stable Earth system. And climate change is one of those processes, an important one. We also have to consider biodiversity loss, land system change, freshwater change, pollution, all these other things that don't necessarily touch on climate. So Natcap is helping businesses on that next step in their sustainability journey, moving on from just a climate focus to having a more holistic picture of how they interact with the natural world and quantifying the risks that may pose to their business.
Brilliant. That makes perfect sense. And I remember reading something that you had said where nature intelligence, in quotations, is the missing link in climate strategy. So can you explain what that means in practical terms? And I know you kind of just touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can go more practical for us.
Yeah, so we're seeing more and more companies now start to integrate nature into their climate strategies, or actually, more often than not, having an integrated climate and nature strategy, which covers both and ideally together. And the reason for that is firstly because they're recognizing that there are material nature related risks over and above just climate related risks. So, for example, pharmaceutical industry has nature-related risk from its dependence on certain species in its supply chain, certain animals and plants that may be threatened or may be scarce or may be reputationally damaging. And that is not a risk that is captured in a climate lens. So there's this whole category of risk that's just missing with a climate-only lens. I think there's also a growing understanding that there are unintended consequences for nature when actions and mitigations focus only on climate mitigation, but also climate adaptation. So, for example, if you're just trying to minimize emissions with nature-based solutions, you might plant monoculture spruce trees or eucalyptus plantations that are really fast-growing, are absorbing a ton of carbon. But in so doing, you might be devastating ecosystems or certainly building a pretty fragile one for the longer term. So that climate lens alone, people are realizing is a bit too narrow and can actually be dangerous. And then I think there's also a recognition that there are synergies and cost efficiencies when addressing climate and nature together, rather than looking at either them both separately or climate change on its own. So, for example, financial opportunities when designing effective nature-based solutions and synergies, creating incentive schemes to mitigate both at the same time, and doing it together just makes financial and strategic sense. The world of a climate strategy that stands completely alone and doesn't look at nature is an old world that's dying, and people are realizing they need to bring this new lens into things.
Without a doubt, I mean, you need to absolutely have a more 360-degree lens of what's going on. And as important as climate is, and thankful that many companies are focusing on that, I think you're exactly right. That is, like, companies and people out there that are moving along in that journey are starting to realize it's just one piece of the puzzle. And there are many other nature targets that need to be focused on as well to make the strategy as strong foundationally as possible, right? So as you had said, like data centers using up water, right? That technically wouldn't fall into climate, even though they're linked. If a data center is only thinking about climate and they're not thinking about their water impact, that is a massive risk. Mm-hmm. So it's just like you have to, for sure, create more comprehensiveness. And it sounds like that's where things are heading, which is good. And so along those lines, how does integrating nature data and all of this other risk data into the financial decision making inside of companies actually help business operations and their bottom lines?
Yeah, so this is crucial. If I take a step back, the world's changed a lot in the last 9 months. This time last year, every business was talking about compliance. We need to do climate, we need to do nature, because we have this tsunami of regulation, primarily the EU, with the Green New Deal regulation, CSRD, EUDR, EUDDD. This is the direction of travel of the world. How do you get my business compliant with these regs as quickly as possible? That was the mood music a year ago in the corporate world. And then it changed. It changed, obviously, with Trump's election. And then it changed with the EU omnibus, kind of rowing back a bit on some of those regs. Mm-hmm. And now the mood music is all, how do I justify sustainability initiatives from a ROI perspective? And how do I show the business value of what sustainability does? So it's a new framing. It's always an important framing. And I like this framing because this is the only framing in a capitalist system that's resilient to the ups and downs of economic cycles and political cycles and so forth. So I think it's actually a step forward. And that is exactly the question everyone's asking. So how do you show the return on some of these nature-related investments? And for us, really, the answer to that is thinking about risk and opportunity, but primarily risk. And the other theme that businesses are really thinking about this year is supply chain risk. And that's in part because of nature, but also because of tariffs and because of all the political uncertainty that's been sent into supply chains. So if you start talking about nature and sustainability through an ROI perspective, you start talking about it through a supply chain resilience perspective, you're suddenly speaking the language of where a lot of business leaders are today. So it's a really important framing. And I think for nature, it's a really compelling one as well. So if you just think about historically, supply chain risk management is really focused on, who am I supplying from? And particularly, what is the price and quality interface I can get for that particular good? There's a new lens now, which is not just climate resilience, but actually nature resilience. What's the risk that this commodity is going to face over different time horizons, from things like physical risks like water scarcity, soil health issues? What are some of the risks it might face from transition risks like reputational damage to the business or regulatory change that means that it would be banned or restricted in some way? So that new lens is really important. And it's really real. If we take any company that we've worked with, food and ag is the one that is the industry that's most exposed. But a lot of the food and ag supply chains are global, and a lot of them face very severe nature-related risks from just about every risk, but primarily water is a big one. So the ability to source water, the ability to maintain soil health, the ability to maintain reputations where agricultural goods are being sourced by areas that are prone to deforestation, the ability to maintain reputations when goods are being sourced in areas that have restrictions on those goods. So there's a whole bunch of very real nature-related risk in supply chains that are there and are just coming to the fore now, and businesses really care about.
I just think of like some of the supply chains of certain companies and how many moving parts go into delivering one product or one service, and how probably for a good amount of companies, they have no insight or eyes on what's happening down their value chain, right? They know that if they need something from somebody else along the value chain, they hope that it comes, but they're not considering the risk of that so much, of what kind of problems this could create if 2 rungs down the ladder, something is happening over here in terms of water or in terms of like forestry. So I would imagine from value chain risk, you guys are super in the weeds with a lot of your clients as well.
Yep. And just some big ones. I think there's definitely the prejudice that nature is CSR, it's fluffy, it's NGOs, it's not real. But some of the numbers that are starting to materialize from nature-related risks going wrong are huge. So 3M is an example I like. They've been releasing forever chemicals into water courses for a long time. They actually knew about it for a long time and didn't do much about it. And they, a couple of years ago, had a $10.5 billion lawsuit that they had to settle with water companies to pay for the damages incurred there. And that's the kind of numbers that start to hit your P&L in a meaningful way. If you look at TSMC, the world's largest chip manufacturer, they started having to bring water in by truck in 2021 when there were water shortages in Taiwan. And that caused an overnight increase of $500 million in costs just to pay for those water trucks. It's real. These are big numbers. It's happening now. There's a guy called Marco Lambertini, who used to be the head of WWF, who's now the chair of the Nature Positive Initiative. He has this phrase, which is, we are entering the period of consequences, which I really like. And it's this idea that, we've had the warnings, we had our time to mitigate without consequence. We didn't take those options and those opportunities, and now the consequences are here, and they're big and they're real and they're happening now. So nature risk is unfortunately only going to become more prominent on corporate agendas as time goes on, and that's what we're here to try and measure and manage.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's an unfortunate reality that it's not going away on its own. So you've got a couple of different options, right? Is one, to ignore it, which is the wrong pathway, and that's going to end up very bad for business, or two, start to wrap your heads around it and create some sort of strategy.
Yeah.
And I know that you kind of alluded to a few of these earlier in terms of the reporting frameworks and the other nature disclosure rules. So we've got the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Obviously, this isn't something that companies are going to just like fully understand overnight. And of course, they're not going to have a complete comprehensive view of how they need to address it. And so I understand that Natcap also helps your clients prepare for these types of frameworks and these rules. So can you go into how you all are doing that and what kind of services you're offering your clients there?
Yeah. No, look, so when it comes to these frameworks, sustainability leaders and CEOs rarely get super excited about reporting frameworks. Yeah. But what it does do is it opens the door to conversations, which are really important to have. And so we see them as a stepping stone to a bigger conversation, not an end in themselves. So TNFD and CSRD, both are the most prominent from an nature perspective. CSRD is a mandatory piece of EU regulation that is already in effect, that is progressively going to expand in scope over the next 3 years. And it essentially requires businesses operating in the EU, and even those who have revenues in the EU but aren't based in the EU, to start measuring not just climate, but also water, biodiversity, pollution, and waste, and disclose those to investors. That's a really significant piece that has changed how companies interact with this agenda. And then we have TNFD, which is a voluntary framework, but is expecting to fold into ISSB, which is the International Sustainable Standards Body or board. And so we'll have huge reach when that happens. And it has come up with the best in class approach and framework to help businesses voluntarily measure their interactions and risks from nature. So these are two separate frameworks. They're very complementary. If you've done TNFD, you've basically done most of the CSRD work and to some extent vice versa. So that's a bit of context as to what those things are. In terms of why they're hard, so businesses who open these things up for the first time are overwhelmed because hundreds and hundreds of pages of advice and requirements, and they need to figure out what should we be measuring, how should we be measuring those, and how do we package the insights in a way that drive business value. And that's what Natcap does. We have a core software product that's essentially automated what's called the Leape approach, which is a framework in TNFD, which helps you locate your business's interactions with nature across your operations and supply chain. Where are those sites? How close are they to national parks and biodiversity sensitive areas? How close are they to water scarce or drought-prone areas? How close are they to areas in rapid decline of ecosystem integrity? So it's helping you just locate where your business is operating and how at risk they are from those interactions with nature. The next step is evaluate the impacts you're having. So how you are impacting nature in terms of the resources you're using, in terms of the land that you're changing, in terms of the pollution you're generating. And then where are you dependent on nature? So where does your business just depend on some critical ecosystem services to survive? That's step 2. The third step is then assessing. So that's the A. Assessing how does that translate into risk for your business? And does nature provide opportunities for more revenue generation or other new opportunities? And then the final is preparing to disclose all of this information and put it in front of your investors and shareholders. So that's the framework, and we've automated that with a core product, and then we have an advisory team that does a whole bunch of advisory work building on that data. That's where we come in, and we were founded back in 2018, so spun out of Oxford University back then, and the core of what Natcap's been focused on is actually building the metrics. So the metrics that we use to measure each of those steps, to measure how important a particular site is for nature within Locate, to measure the materiality of an impact and or dependency, and then to measure how those pose business risks. Each of those different steps requires a whole bunch of new metrics, a whole bunch of new science that is needed to calculate those metrics, and that's what we spent most of our time and energy doing.
You and I both know that not all companies are created equal, which means that there are going to be a variety of different approaches from the companies that fall under these regulations for disclosure. And from your perspective, what are the risks if companies just treat these reporting and disclosure regulations as simply a box ticking exercise? I mean, there's obviously the monetary risks, but what are other ones that you see companies should be aware of if they just do the basic box ticking?
So I'm actually quite comfortable with companies treating this as a box ticking exercise for now, if it starts a conversation. And I would rather a company start to measure their interaction with nature, start to understand those impacts dependencies, have them somewhere, and even if they're just doing a minimum disclosure to meet what the law tells them to, at least they're starting a conversation, which I hope over time will grow into something more substantial. And by more substantial, I mean actually looking at what are those business risks, looking at how you can mitigate them, starting to actually implement some of these mitigation strategies and embed nature data into decision-making more holistically. So if they want to start with a box checking, I actually think that's fine. And I think the CSRD regulation has made this much more mainstream than it otherwise would be. And the majority of companies engaging with that regulation are just trying to get it out of the way because they see it as a massive pain in the ass. So box checking, as a first step, I'm comfortable with. I'd rather have some data out there in the company corporate hands than none. The onus then on the sustainability teams and on folks like Natcap, but also actually on other folks in the ecosystem like regulators and NGOs and others, is then to help those sustainability leaders make the business case for doing something with this data that doesn't just sit on a shelf and get put in a pretty report. And that's about connecting impacts and dependencies to risks, quantifying those risks, and making the business case for mitigation, or if there are opportunities for new revenue generation, to harness those. And that's actually triggered a broader thought, which is I'm quite sanguine on and realistic on the role of these frameworks and the role of private enterprise in addressing the nature crisis. And I think we can do some of the work with the current system and the current incentives, but we can't do all the work. And I think it's valuable to confront that and sit with that, even though it's a bit uncomfortable. And by that, I mean, we have a nature crisis where we are living way beyond our planetary boundaries. We are not on course for a long-term sustainable relationship with the earth, and our kids and their kids are going to, at the current rate of consumption, they're going to have a much more difficult planet to live on and maybe not be able to live at the same standards that we've been able to. So something needs to change. Some of that change will come through businesses measuring nature risks, mitigating them, and making the business case for mitigating those risks. But for some of those changes, there just isn't a business case at all today because it's water and natural resources are often free. Pollution is often not charged. Deforestation regulation is not enforced. So in the current system, businesses using data from Natcap can make some of the change, but not all of the change. And I think recognizing that and then in the long term doing something about it is important, because otherwise we might fool ourselves to thinking we're on the path to long-term stability when we're really not.
Yeah, that's an extremely good point. I mean, we have to learn how to walk before we can run. And if you apply that to many businesses, they're still at the kind of crawling space. So I'm with you that any progress, even if it is simply box ticking or wrapping their heads around it, is still a good step in the right direction. All right, Sebastian, so changing directions a little bit, I'm sure you're very well aware that there is growing criticism of biodiversity offsets and nature as a service. So I'm curious, how do you guys balance the need for measurable impact with the risk of oversimplifying nature's value?
So I've been bearish for a long time on biodiversity credits, not because I think they're a bad thing. I think it's a great, clever, innovative way to essentially channel finance into conservation and restoration. So I'm all for the goals it's trying to achieve, but there isn't really a market for it, and there's not going to be a market for it for the foreseeable future. And that's because there's no demand. There's very little demand. How the biodiversity and nature-related goals haven't really been set yet. So you need a goal to be able to justify an offset. When they have been set, they've not really been set in units that would allow for an easy offset. I think there's all kinds of philosophical issues with the locality and the location-specific nature of nature and biodiversity, which means that just because you damage something here doesn't necessarily mean you can offset there. The demand side is just too messy, too riddled with controversy, and too immature in its frameworks for thinking about this to create a market in the near term. So I think that effort and energy that's going into biodiversity credits is a bit misplaced, and we should redirect all those brilliant people and resources to markets that are providing a bit more scalable.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like the fundamentals of any market, of course, is supply and demand. And without demand, it just seems as if it's not the most efficient use of a lot of time and brain power. So unless we can get that right and kind of create the demand, which there's no indication that that's going to really happen. Although I know, of course, there's separate COPs talking about this, but still it does feel like it's a ways off, and the amount of progress it's made over the last decade is pretty minimal.
Yeah. One of the goals of biodiversity credit is to channel money into conservation and to conserve more of the planet for nature and natural ecosystems. I'm more optimistic on regulation as a lever to do that, and particularly the 30 by 30. The COP15 summit in Montreal and the Global Biodiversity Framework committed us all to putting aside 30% of the planet by 2030 for nature. And so lobbying governments to live by that promise and to strengthen the protections for national parks, federal and government-owned land, and use that as a lever feels more promising than building a market where there isn't demand.
Yeah, exactly. And thankfully, there has been a good amount of progress in those biodiversity COPs. So I'm right there with you. Okay, Sebastian, as we are inching towards the end of this episode, I always like to wrap it up in two ways. The first is looking towards the future. So it's hard to believe that we're basically in September. When you're like 9 months ago, things changed. And I'm like, oh yeah, Trump got elected 9 months ago. That's madhouse. Like I still remember January as if it was yesterday. Okay, anyways, so towards the end of the year and into the near future, what's on the horizon for Natcap?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the future. Things are moving insanely quickly. And if I think about 2 years ago when I started this, 3 years ago when I started this job, no company was spending money measuring nature, period, and particularly not measuring their impact on nature and the risks it posed their business. It just wasn't really happening, apart from a few global leaders. And today it's becoming relatively mainstream among the world's largest companies. So we've made huge progress in the last 3 years. TNFD's launched, 600 early adopters, CSRD's live, thousands of initial reports. So it's really gone mainstream. And so we're now on that exponential growth curve of adoption. So that's one thing I'm excited by, is just the number of companies adopting. And then the sophistication with which they're starting to measure those interactions with nature is also on that exponential curve. So year one, maybe you're just using some very basic industry average data. And in year 2 and 3, you're starting to get really specific in terms of where your sites are, where your supply chain is, how those are being managed, and what that means for you. So on both fronts, I think this is a base that's maturing quickly. Really excited to be at the forefront of it. And for us, what that means is a lot of progress on both those fronts. Progress in the number of companies we serve. We've been much more than doubling every year so far. So looking forward to that to continue. And then deepening the capabilities and particularly automating. In the first couple of years of this journey, a lot of companies have needed a lot of hand-holding and support from our consultants, but now growing in confidence and looking to get a lot of this data in an increasingly automated way. So building the capabilities in our SaaS platform to make that possible is another big milestone for us over the next year.
Hell yeah, mate. I like to hear those growth numbers. That's fantastic. Certainly strong momentum for you all. And so I know that as leading the company is probably extremely pleasing and encouraging for you.
Yeah, very much so.
Great. All right, Sebastian. So the last question, it is the same that I ask all the guests, and it taps into stoicism. And so Epictetus, the great Stoic from back in the day, once said, "What concerns me is not the way things are, but the way people think things are." So if we modify this question specifically to you, my question is, what do you think is one thing that must be done to change how people think about nature?
So the people I have in mind are business leaders who have it in their power to massively change the planet's trajectory and how humanity engages with nature. So that's what I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of people. And I want those people to stop thinking about nature as just something they use at the weekends with their kids for recreation and recognize it is underpinning their entire business. And as a result, should be treated with that same level of care, sophistication, engagement as any other issue that is underpinning your entire business. So reframing nature away from CSR, away from recreation, away from the non-work to the core language of business and as a critical business risk.
Man, right on the money. Less extractive and more of like a harmony with it for sure. So I appreciate that. I think that it's kind of ironic, right? It's like we go and we spend time in nature, and then once we like leave the park, we kind of forget about it and don't really think about all the value that it just added us in terms of memories and exercise and health, and then we just leave it there. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, where it's like, let's bring these together and keep it in mind. So really appreciate that. Cool. Sebastian, thank you, mate, for coming. Thank you for your time and your insights. This was a great episode. We haven't yet really gotten into this type of work that you all do on any of the prior podcast episodes. So this is a good one, and I think that the audience will really appreciate it. So thanks for coming in.
Thanks so much, Jay. Appreciate it.
Likewise. Take it easy. That's it for today's ep of Untangling Climate Finance. A massive thanks to Sebastian Leape for sharing his wisdom on how nature intelligence is transforming business strategy and climate finance. If you want to learn more about Natcap and the work that they're doing, check out the link to their website in the show notes. And be sure to follow the podcast on Apple and Spotify so you don't miss future eps. And as always, thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Jay Tipton. This podcast is brought to you by Gordian Strategies.